Welcome to A Time to Think. That's our new name of the podcast, A Time to Think. Chris,
Time to think.
you'd offer an idea, I'd offer an idea, we'd hate each other's ideas.
Yeah.
Other people would hear our ideas and go, and finally, we just kind of inched closer to each other in order to find a name.
In fact, we spent a lot of time thinking about the title, and it came up as A Time to Think. So
Why is this a good title for what we're doing?
why is it a good title? Well, because we want this to be a time to think.
Wow, you are
It's very deep, very profound.
effervescent in your language.
Here's the deal. We found in this process that nobody else on planet Earth decided to use the title A Time to Think in a podcast
so
either
the primary reason is because
originality.
No one
We want to be authentic. We
Okay.
care about authenticity. And so we care about your ability to find the podcast as well, because you can just type it in and you're not going to find anyone else.
Because no
with
one
the
else
title.
likes to
No one
think.
else liked it at all. So we decided to like it, and that's where we are today.
Let me say that's a secondary reason. What the reason we even thought to look for words like think or a time to think is because of the primary purpose of this podcast, which is every time I say this sentence, it doesn't sound that attractive, but I'm going to keep saying it because it's our goal.
Keep doing it.
We want to slow down and block out a chunk of time on a weekly basis to think through some really important things. Because, Chris, what you and I see in our culture is quick responses, emotional responses, passionate responses, but honestly, not very much thinking.
Yeah.
And so, playing off Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8 says there's a time for war and a time for peace. There's a time to build and a time to pluck up. There's a time to laugh. There's a time to weep. Hopefully, we will both laugh and weep
Oh, yes.
in the presence of one another.
And there is now a time to think.
No, there's a time to think.
Yeah.
Because actually, you and I, Chris, would both agree there is a time to act,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
There's a time to vote. There's a time to act. There's a time to engage. If we don't stop first to think, though, our actions are going to be discolored. Our actions are going to be misdirected.
Yep.
So our goal here, to put it in the words of Carl Trueman, who we've started going through his book, is if we don't understand, if we don't think, we cannot respond. We cannot act. Kind of a jovial intro, Chris. We're going to switch gears to a heavier topic because this is one we have to think about. And in the past few weeks, there has been an overturning of a local case in Mississippi called the Dobbs, which has led to an even grander overturning of national cases from the past 50 years. So the decision in Dobbs effectively overturns Roe and Casey, which had been the law of the land for 50 years, declaring constitutional rights to abortion. And since the decision about Dobbs and the overturning of Roe and Casey, there's been just an incredible amount of passion and fervor. There's been celebration from pro-lifers that have spent the past 50 years working and picketing and voting. There has been distress and anger from people on the pro-choice side. And I think this quote here from a guy named Neil Shenvi really unpacks why this has been so drastic. And Neil is just a wonderful, wonderful thinker who I think is balanced, clear, and never attacks, which I appreciate in today's day and age. And he wants us to say, why is this conversation so charged? He says this: if opponents of abortion are wrong, pro-lifers, then they are attempting to strip women of their rights. If abortion advocates are wrong, then they are complicit in a moral atrocity to which every genocide in human history pales in comparison. So once again, if pro-life causes are wrong, they are ripping rights away from individuals that have human dignity, right? That's a heavy burden. If pro-choicers are wrong, then there is an attachment to a moral atrocity, Neil Shenvi is saying. Which is why this is such there's no neutral position here, which is even more reason for us to slow down, stop, and have a time to think, right? Chris, as you have, you've followed the political sphere for a number of years. You've mentioned before that you were a poli-sci major, so the different jockeying in the legislatures and in the courts over abortion is not new to you. So with your political background, what have you seen in the past few weeks since Dobbs was overturned?
I would say a fundamental misunderstanding of the legal implications of this whole process, to be honest. I'll say right off the bat, and I've noted this before in the podcast that, I'm a very pro-life individual.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I take very, very seriously in politics and just in, my role as a pastor. But when it comes to just looking at it from a political level, and our goal here is to help people understand that these issues are not just emotional, right? I mean, that's why we're doing this, is it's not just emotional. And so I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on social media. I'll kind of bounce in on Twitter at times to see what people are saying. It's not usually a very helpful thing, but at least gives you kind of the lay of the land as far as where people are at.
The only reason I like Twitter over Facebook is because I don't personally know any of the
Yes,
people on
exactly.
Twitter. So if someone says something dumb on Twitter, I don't have to think I have to
Here we
deal
go
with that
again.
person.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a removal that's helpful for me on
Yes,
Twitter.
yes.
Whereas Facebook, it's like, I want to see pictures of your puppies.
Yep.
Nothing else.
That's
please.
it. Yep. And so I think with kind of putting your thumb on the pulse to see where things are at, it's been. I think it's representative of where our culture just is basically at this point. Responses to issues, whether they are social issues, whether they're political issues, tend to be emotionally driven with a profound lack of critical thinking and a profound lack of context for why people will make the statements they do, why people will go out. I mean, I know, people in our church have sent stuff to us. They've sent, like screenshots, memes people will put out. And I look at that and I'm just, I shake my head because I'm like, man, this is not capturing what's actually happening right now. And so for us to be able to have these discussions, it is an important thing. And then to just kind of bring it back to, from a political perspective, from a background where this has been something, I mean, since I started college 22 years ago, this has been an issue. It's been talked about. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's actually going on at this point. And people just see it as, what you brought up initially of ripping away rights or the murder of children. So
So if we, one thought on what you said there, Chris, is you said a profound feeling is leading to the reactions. So if Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," where Rousseau brought us to today is to say, "I feel, therefore I am."
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
I think the Simone Biles controversy like 2 years ago sticks out in my head a lot because I remember hearing about it and feeling like I needed to say something. Like I needed to offer my opinion.
Sure.
And I didn't. And then 4 days later, I was like, oh, that initial opinion was wrong. And I was glad I didn't offer that opinion.
Sure.
But we live in a culture where it feels like you're compelled to say what you feel or think immediately.
Yep.
But how often, parents with kids know that if you talk to your kids in a moment of passion, spouses know this. If you're looking for a response from your spouse in a moment of passion, it's not clear-headed.
Yeah.
You and I are pastors, Chris. Sundays are emotionally taxing days and passion-filled days. Don't ask me how I'm doing on a Sunday afternoon.
Correct.
Because I am so in my emotional state that I can't think well.
Yep.
But our culture, if you feel it, you should say it. And so, but oftentimes those feelings, like you're saying, are robbed of context. For instance, you take something like rights are being taken away. In some sense, that's true because Roe kind of canonized a right to abortion. But if you step back historically and say, there's a lot of people, probably the majority of legal scholars, that believe that was a nefarious case, that there was actually no right in the Constitution.
Yeah.
So this brings me to something I've observed is language really matters. So when we're talking about the overturning of Roe, you can say a right is being taken away. Well, that sounds really bad.
Right.
Or you can say the right was never there
Correct.
and this has been corrected. Well, that sounds less bad.
Yeah.
Another example here would be the pro-choice movement might say you are taking rights from women. Once again, that sounds really bad. The pro-life movement might say you are protecting the rights of children. And so we see how the the cultivating of language is so important here, because if you change key terms in a similar sentence, then I'll even go so far as to use the word propaganda, because that's how propaganda works. Is you have these short, pithy, snappy statements intended to incite emotion, and so when we see something like the right of abortion is being taken away, to step back historically and say, well, it seems clear that that right was not actually in the Constitution, and then that means that the initial ruling was improper, and therefore overturning an improper ruling, we would agree in the cases of Plessy versus Ferguson or Brown versus Board of Education, that it was really good to overturn an improper ruling.
There was a case, Dred Scott, that occurred in the mid-1800s that we were very happy was overturned.
Maybe that's what I was thinking instead of Brown versus Board.
Well, Brown versus Board and Plessy was separate but equal and going forward. So both of those situations, whether it's separate but equal or the Dred Scott case where you have a slave being returned, those are terrible decisions that were made, but they were made with the idea that, okay, well, we are going to kind of package a legal ethos into a case. And I think what's important for us to understand is that from a Christian perspective, we look at the Bible as the only inerrant and authoritative document. And so when we look at what justices on a Supreme Court do, we have to be willing to say, guess what? They do make mistakes, and they make decisions that may be either misinterpreting the Constitution or maybe morally incorrect. And when we look at
which we can all agree, because you either believe Roe was a mistake or the overturning of Dobbs was a mistake, and in either case, you believe the Supreme Court made a mistake. So we can't say that you should never overturn precedent, because everyone believes one of those two was a mistake. So everyone believes at some point the court makes a mistake. And so this type of stepping back and going, all right, if someone shouts, this is the law of the country, or this is the precedent, you say, well, what was the precedent? Are there other times where you've overturned precedent? In what cases should you overturn precedent? But now we're asking some follow-up questions, which I think are, Chris, in this era of snappy statements, I think follow-up questions are enormous.
Absolutely.
Women should have the right to choose. Choose what?
Choose what?
Because depending on what the end of that sentence is, I would largely agree with many of the statements. And so I think that's where language is important, and follow-up questions at this point are super important. I did cut you off. Were you going somewhere else?
No, keep going. This is the two of us.
So that's one thing I've thought is, if we actually want to engage with someone in this conversation, we're going to need to be willing to ask who, what, when, where, why questions.
Absolutely.
Basic English grammar questions.
Journalism. You learn journalism.
Why should someone have the right to choose? Who should have the right to choose? And get some information here, because I was just listening to someone recently talk about how the age of social media has changed us to just accept and traffic in these short statements that are so vague and lack so much nuance. That they're unhelpful, but they're emotional. And so if we actually want to engage with people, we got to take 30 minutes to sit down, stop, and ask some questions.
In the words of Vanilla Ice, stop, collaborate, and listen.
Who knew?
Who knew?
That Vanilla Ice would be so prescient.
Well,
here
we are.
Such forethought.
Here we are.
We have come to an age where Vanilla Ice is the best philosopher.
Profoundly philosophical statements,
goodness. Chris, you've mentioned that as you have observed, and let me give, I guess, the direction where we're going here. We want to provide a little bit more observations since the Dobbs decision. At the end of this episode, we want to talk a little bit about religious and philosophical, rational views of human life. And then in a subsequent episode, we're going to run through kind of the 5 most common pro-choice arguments that I've heard, that we've heard, and just say, what would the pro-lifer, because we understand that the large portion of our church are either already committed pro-lifers, maybe have the conviction of life starting at conception, but don't have the articulation of thoughts, or maybe even you're a Christian who has been surrounded by pro-life energy, and you've quietly disagreed with that, but you need help thinking through those types of things. So you wanted to offer one more thought, Chris, on the idea of self and convenience in regards to the abortion conversation.
Yeah, and when we talked about bringing this up, I mean, it's both a timely matter in terms of the culture, because we want to, with a time to think rightly about things that are pressing. So we're not gonna sit here and think about issues that might be pertaining to Amazonian tribal cultures, because we just don't have that influencing us here and now. But
we also wouldn't want to miss the forest for the trees.
We've got some great ones today. I hope you're appreciating everything coming out of our mouths. This is being recorded on a Monday.
Don't set the bar too high that they're supposed to appreciate everything.
Like
we
Josh
hope you've
says,
appreciated one thing.
Yeah, our emotions get a little wacky after Sunday when we're done with corporate worship. But when it comes to thinking about things that are relevant, that's something we value, and that's why we're doing this. But it also fits within what we're doing in this broader series of the rise and triumph of the modern self is the bigger volume that Carl Trueman put together that really gives a sense, an historical context, a philosophical context for why we function the way that we do. And I think what we're talking about with this issue, it fits right in. It fits right in with why we are the way that we are today as a culture. And so the reflections of individuals now pertaining to the issue of abortion are completely in line. They're in no way inconsistent with the broader cultural atmosphere that we live in, that we've been talking about for the past several weeks, and we'll continue to talk about once these couple episodes are wrapped up. So,
in no way inconsistent means consistent.
That is correct.
I think.
Double negative.
Okay. So how are they consistent?
Yeah.
What ideas are you seeing in the reactions to Dobbs that you feel are consistent with some of the things we're learning in Truman?
Sure. So one of the things that I brought up to you was the term, and it's a heavy term, and I think it's a term that's accurate, is the cult of self that exists within our culture. And so when we spoke about Rousseau a few weeks back, and Rousseau's whole idea of just really intense personal self-aggrandizement, and I'm going to put a negative spin on it because it's not right to live as though the world revolves around you. I mean, as Christians, we understand the world exists for God. It exists by the power of God, for the glory of God, for all of eternity. That's what it exists for. It's not for us as individual human beings who function on this earth to determine what is best, what is right, what is good. And yet, when we have this discussion about abortion, and we have the discussion, just the idea of pro-choice, right? That term, choice, being applied to this. I know that those who advocate for the accessibility, availability of abortion don't like the term pro-abortion being used,
right?
Because first of all, it sounds bad, because it is. But second of all, because
it goes back to language, which we talked about earlier.
Yes, exactly. So you couch a position, but I think the broader atmosphere that we exist in is an environment that says personal choice is the most sacred of values that effectively personify a human being. Like, you're a person if you can choose to do what you want, when you want, how you want it.
And this goes back to a school of thought called Existentialism. In the Christian sphere, we're talking about Soren Kierkegaard. In the non-Christian sphere, we're talking about Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. That essentially existentialists believed that the core of humanity involves will and choice.
Yeah.
So you are who you are, not like Descartes because of your thoughts, not like Rousseau because of your feelings, but you are who you are because of your choices and your will and your actions.
And that's all there is.
Which means you have to be able to choose, and
Correct.
you have to be able to have will, and you have
Correct.
to be able to act.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think as we think through this idea of pro-choice, and you've used the term before, Chris, inviolable. The self is inviolable, which when you hear that, you might think inviolatable. You can't violate it, right? And so then we start to say that a lot of folks want to make decisions based on not violating their person, not violating their self. But we've mentioned the idea of no-fault divorce before as something that someone might make that choice, saying, right now marriage is violating my happiness. I don't want my happiness to be violated, and so I am going to end the marriage. But that decision violates the happiness of the spouse and the children and the in-laws. And so we can see even in that one example that you can't make a decision that only impacts you.
Correct.
Even if we go way, way, way to the extreme of suicide, Timothy Keller has made this point really helpfully. Someone who takes their own life, generally someone might say, I wouldn't do it, but you should have the choice to. That would be the cultural sphere we're in right now.
Right.
But the problem being, if a 19-year-old takes their life, presumably a parent or two has put 19 years of energy, both emotional and financial, has paused, halted their life for 19 years. There are teachers, there are religious communities, there are neighbors, all of which have put some sort of investment into that person's life. So even at the extreme of something like suicide, taking your own life, you cannot choose to do an action that only impacts you.
Correct.
That all of our actions harm or benefit other people. And I think that's one of the maybe underlying lies of the pro-choice movement, is that you can do an action that only impacts you. And I think where the pro-life movement would say is we really want to talk about the impact on the unborn child, but even on the other spouse. There are impacts that ripple out.
Yeah, and one more thing to kind of add to that, a common thing, if I'll be talking with a non-Christian about Jesus, and maybe you're a non-Christian and watching this, and asking the question about, well, if I'm doing something that doesn't hurt somebody else, and in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, the question about whether or not an unborn child as a person is there, and from a pro-life perspective, we would certainly say that, yes, that is a person. But when it comes to the idea of how do we determine who this is harming, who is this action harming, from a Christian perspective, what I would say, and it's important, and so I'll speak directly to the Christian as well at this point, there is an individual, a triune individual in this world, in this universe, that we also have to take into account. And one of the most grievous things that I've seen when it comes to individuals who will identify as Christian people and yet hold this very personal, like, well, this is a decision only impacting the woman, and saying, even if you're going to dismiss an unborn child's personhood, what does God think about this? What does God feel about this as one who gives life, who creates life? What is this saying to and about him? And so I do think it's important when we kind of extrapolate out the impact of decisions that we make, that we are very aware that there is never, especially from a Christian perspective, but even from a secular perspective, like you mentioned, whether it's coaches, teachers, employers, parents, brothers, sisters, whomever it might be, that there are people that are always impacted by decisions that are made, and
And from a Christian perspective, the person greatest impact of all is the Lord himself.
Is God himself, correct.
This is a great lead-in, Chris, to the end of this podcast, where I want to talk about religious claims about abortion versus, when we throw out the word secular, what we mean is arguments that are made from as non-organized religion.
Right.
They're not coming from a Buddhist perspective or an Islamic perspective or a Christian perspective. They're trying to make scientific or philosophical claims that don't have to do with God.
Right.
So that's secular. So I want to distinguish a religious position on where life begins from a secular position. And I think, Chris, you've given us a great segue, because one of those snappy, pithy statements, and I think this is the type of statement you would hear from someone like President Biden, is I am personally against abortion, but I'm not in the room with the woman and her doctor.
Sure.
And that, a lot of these seem compelling at first. I don't know if you find yourself, but I find myself scrolling through and I'm like, oh dang, that one feels like it's right. So then you think about it, and you're saying, Chris, very helpfully from a Christian perspective, there is no room in which the Lord Jesus Christ is not.
Correct.
And that's Abraham Kuyper.
Yep.
Says there is no square inch in all of the cosmos over which the Lord Jesus does not cry, mine.
Yeah.
There is no bedroom. There is no doctor's office.
Yeah.
There is no court of law in which the Lord Jesus Christ does not cry, mine.
Yep.
So from a Christian perspective, we cannot segment decisions we make in the church from decisions we make in a doctor's office or decisions we make in our bedroom.
Does that make us theocrats, Josh?
That's the next episode.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that.
That's one of the pro-choice rebuttals is we now live in a theocracy, meaning the church makes the law.
Right.
And we'll respond to that in a second. First, I want to talk about religious versus non-religious positions about human life. I don't think Christians need to be afraid of the religious position, but they should also know the non-religious position.
Correct.
Okay? So here's a religious position, Chris. In Psalm 139, in Psalm 51, and in Jeremiah 1, the Lord tells me that he knits life in the womb and that he knows life before the womb. Those are very clear statements. In Ephesians 1, the Lord tells me that he has chosen you and I before the foundation of the world, which means his setting of his love on us was before not only you were conceived, but before the world was conceived. And Romans 8 tells me that it is the ones God foreknew that he predestined, the ones that he predestined he called, the one he called he justified. So once again, the order of events there is that he has a knowledge of me before he even plans my life.
Before an embryo, right?
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes people will say, the Bible doesn't talk about abortion. One, my wife has really helpfully showed me this, is if anyone ever says, the Bible doesn't really mention, it probably does. And if it doesn't, it gives you principles to understand it. And so in this case, the Bible specifically says in 3 places, at least, Psalm 51, where David said, I was sinful as I was conceived in my mother's womb. Psalm 139, the Lord knits me together in my mother's womb. And Jeremiah 1, I'm forgetting the exact language, but the Lord knew him before the womb. And then what's so important biblically is to understand the narrative. The grand narrative, the grand sweep of the Bible is that God knows people and things before he creates them. That's the whole of the story. That applies to the plan of salvation, that applies to the redemption of the world, and that applies to humans being conceived. And so that in itself is a principle that directly applies to the abortion conversation. Now, everything I just said, the Christian needs to know. And everything I just said, a non-Christian might laugh at.
Right.
Because I'm operating theocratically. I'm letting God tell me what to do with the government. Chris, can you give me a non-religious argument for life that starts at conception, life that is in the womb?
I don't want to function out of bounds, to be clear, so I'm not going to make claims to being a scientist or a medical doctor. I'm not going to make that kind of a claim, which is why I think what I'm about to say and what we can talk about, even toward a non-Christian perspective of life, a pro-life position, makes it all the more compelling. So here's where I'm going with this. We have at this point, in the year 2022, we have at this point more than enough scientific device usage in play and common usage, not just like you're not going to looking at the particle collider over in Europe or something.
You're talking ultrasounds.
We're looking at ultrasounds. Yeah, we're looking at ultrasounds. We're looking at electron microscopes where we can actually see what's going on a cellular level with certain things. And if you just look at it, you can see like little embryo dividing. Right? Things are happening. It's not like something just kind of teleports into a woman's body at a certain point. And so when we think about this from a perspective that is purely biological, all right, and so a secular humanist could agree with this statement if he puts his ethics kind of even to the side and say, all right, we're going to look at this.
Put it another way. Someone that's non-religious could agree with this and also disagree that the Lord Jesus is in the room.
Yes.
And that's the point, is we want to say there's a separate but winsome argument.
Yes, absolutely. And so if we can utilize these resources, we can take a look. I'm a dad of 6 kids, and I've been excited every single time one of them we knew was coming into existence. And one of the huge blessings of being alive at this time is that we would go in to see our children before we could see them, right? So if you're a parent, you know that feeling of seeing that first ultrasound. And you know, for me, I'm way too impatient to wait until birth to know boy or girl. And so every time, like, okay, and for those who don't know me, I have 5 girls and 1 boy. And so I'm like, I'd like to even out the team at some points because it's me and my son and then my wife and our 5 girls, and I love them dearly. But
the Lord is just shaping you and refining you in Simeon.
Yeah, I love being a girl dad. I really do.
Yeah.
I love being a dad of little girls. It's fantastic. But you know, every time you go in, you're like, okay, is that a girl? Is that a boy? And you ask the ultrasound tech, and they're looking. And at no point in any of these experiences have I ever seen somebody who's an ultrasound tech say, this fetus has the beginnings of a vagina. This is not what's being said. It's a girl.
Yeah.
And that's not because we're stupid and can't understand language of biological significance. It's, you look at it and say, this is a girl. This is a boy. By the same token, my wife and I experienced a miscarriage a few years ago, and we went in and, you know, we're hoping to experience that same joy of seeing our child for the first time. And we go in, and the ultrasound tech is somber, right? And so we had been through that enough at that point to know something's not right, you know? And when she's doing the scan of my wife's body at that point, looking for the body of our little baby, saying, your child has died.
Everyone in that room knows you didn't lose the potential of something.
Correct.
You lost someone.
Something. Yeah, and it's not, and just to be clear, and I don't think this is an emotional
in the same
argument.
way, and maybe I'll flesh this out.
Yeah.
In the same way, because potentiality can involve a lot of emotion.
Sure.
Like, my wife and I were watching The Crown last night, a show on Netflix about the British Empire. And there was a scene where a mudslide or a coal slide from a plant had overtaken a school and killed like 100 kids. And there is a deep sense with children dying of the loss of potential, what could have been, what they could have done. But just because potential is there does not mean life's not there, because we all understand that the child died. And the same is true in the womb. Is like, sure, part of it is potential development, potential growth, but that's the true with a 6-year-old too.
Yep.
And like I'm saying, everyone in that room, ultrasound tech, you don't know, I presume you didn't ask her any religious questions to understand her faith, but everyone in that room understood that you had lost someone, not just lost the potential of T-ball or the potential, you had lost someone.
Yeah, and to just even take that a step further, the obstetrician that walked through that with us at that point was a gentleman who came into the room and tried to put it as scientific as possible, right, as he's talking to us. And, you know, the ultrasound tech can't, you know, kind of legally, technically, medically give you the results. They can't tell you outright, even though they can give you an idea. And the doctor came into the room, and the word that he used was, you experienced a fetal demise. And I heard that, and I was like, I turn it around because of my pro-life convictions, but even from a medical perspective, my baby died, right? So you can use whatever language that you want to talk about fetal demise. You can say that, but everybody knows when you have a miscarriage, something happened that's not like you lost your toenail, you know, or something happened where, you know, even let's say you got your thumb cut off. That's not the same thing. You know, you can grieve the loss of a thumb, but there's something very different. And this is maybe even an emotional argument for an unbeliever to say, you can dismiss God out of the picture, but even if you're relying on your own emotions, how do you feel when somebody tells you that whether you, and I'll kind of couch in these terms, for somebody who doesn't believe in a God, for somebody who doesn't have any religious convictions necessarily, for them to be told out of a baby you, quote, wanted, that this child has died, how is that grief any different over the child you believe to be a child at that point? How is that grief any different than for somebody who says, I didn't want that, so therefore it's not a child? That's where we have to kind of start getting to brass tacks over these issues and saying, if we're going to dismiss everything else and just kind of get to personal terms, biological terms, is the fact that you wanted or did not want that child to be a child significant enough to make that child a child or not a child? So, just getting to kind of those philosophical
questions. It goes back to existentialism,
Yes.
essentially.
Yes.
I am choosing the truth here, rather than there being some objective truth. And we're going to talk in future podcasts about how many of the thinkers recently have led us to believe that objective external morality is oppressive. But I want to say just a few more things about what I would call a rational position about life beginning at conception.
Yeah.
Rational meaning it's logical, it's not religiously based, because in our next episode, we're going to go through some pro-choice arguments, and I think most of the time we're going to come back to the fact that that argument really has nothing to do with when life begins.
Sure.
And so the crux of the issue is, when does life begin? Because if life begins at conception, and we believe that you can't take innocent life, then we can't take innocent life that began at conception.
Right.
So really the entire argument, it hinges on point number one,
Correct.
doesn't it? So we have to spend our entire time arguing point number one. So I would say I've already given the Christian reason why we receive truth from God. The more rational thing would be when my son was born, he had the same DNA at 38 weeks when he was born, coming out of the womb, cutting the umbilical cord, same DNA that he had at 20 to 24 weeks, which people would say is his viability with American technology. He had the same DNA at 20 to 24 weeks as he had at 12 weeks when we saw that first ultrasound. He had the same DNA at 12 weeks that he had at 6 weeks, which is approximately when heartbeats generally begin. And so when you backtrack, I think this is where Neil Shinvey, who I mentioned earlier, is once again helpful. He says, or maybe this is Andrew Walker, who's an ethicist, works at Southern Baptist, says, embryo, fetus, infant, child, adolescent, and adult are not names for different kinds of beings. They are names for the same kind of being at different stages of development. Yeah. And we know that.
Yep.
Your children are children. Yeah. They will one day be, well, you have teenagers, right? You might say like infant, toddler, teenager.
Right.
Those are not different beings. Yeah. And we know the same is true. Embryo at conception, a fetus in the early stages, a newborn, a toddler. These are all the same beings with the same DNA at different stages of development. Yep. So that's a rational, non-religious argument. And I would say where the pro-life movement is very helpful is to say conception is the only rational beginning, because if you were to say that life starts at viability, then we must explain what changed between week 17 and week 20. Right. It's the same thing if life begins at birth, which was often a common position for people, that life began at birth or life began with a religious rite 8 weeks in or 8 days in. You must explain what changed other than location between the womb and being out of the womb. Right. What changed other than a cut of scissors between attachment and non-attachment. Yeah. The same is true with heartbeat. If we say that a heartbeat is at 6 weeks, and I sense a growing movement that people, even non-religious people, are saying like, yeah, heartbeat makes sense as the beginning of life. Well, when did the heart start developing? Right. Because for a heart to beat, it has to develop. Okay, well, now we're backtracking before 6 weeks. Really, the only rational point where something changed is at conception. And this is where Neil Shinvey, once again, is really helpful, is he says, sperm cells don't grow into humans. Egg cells do not grow into humans. So when someone says that an embryo is just a clump of cells, they are negating the fact that blood cells do not grow into humans. Right. Skin cells do not grow into humans. Yep. In fact, many cells are really expendable. They die pretty frequently and they get replaced. Blood cells are always turning over. That's why you can give blood away, right? Yeah. And none of that blood you give away will ever turn into a human being. But the natural progression of events, the overwhelmingly natural progression of events, is when a sperm and an egg combine and conception happens. Yep. That ends up in a human. Yep. And so the logical progression from zygote on is human. Yep. And that's
unique. unique human. That's an
Unique,
important
right.
distinction. Yeah.
And that's the only, and where you say unique is another rational argument would be when we speak of pregnant women, we don't speak, I broke that. When we speak of pregnant women, we don't speak of women having 4 legs or 4 arms
Correct.
or 2 hearts or 4 lungs,
Yep.
right? We speak of a woman who still is 2-legged that is pregnant.
Yeah.
And even just that language shows us that we don't intuitively believe that the growing child is part of the woman's body.
Right. Or a parasite.
Or a parasite. We believe it's actually separate.
Yep.
It's separate yet inhabiting, or separate yet connecting, just as when a child comes out of the womb, still connected by the umbilical cord, it's a separate child.
Yeah.
It's just connected.
Yep.
So there's a couple rational arguments that maybe you can be able to use to engage people about that fundamental question of when does life begin. Chris, this is when the podcast ends, and we are going to record a second one about some different pro-choice reactions we've been hearing and how the Christian might respond.
Yeah, and that's what we're really going to get into, for your reference of you watching this. We're really going to get into talking through what these, we talked about a couple of ideas and discussion points and perspectives and arguments that might be made, but really in the next episode, we're going to focus a lot and focus mostly on how to engage on these different positions, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.